So, question for Lauren. You mentioned in passing GDPR. I'm just curious if the Europeans would have those issues.
I've been really focused on what's going on here because there's so much, but to me that seems fairly settled. I don't have the most up-to-date GDPR. Does anyone else?
No, just in terms of on the AI related issues. So GDPR is created a furor either down the world of AI. So I was wondering if Europeans or Germans in particular, and Europeans more generally are looked at the same issues that you're talking about in terms of getting us into the modernizing privacy laws for the AI era. Because this GDPR sort of became the high watermark for the world.
Yeah, and of course it influenced the US process. I don't know where they are, but I will say, I hope they're somewhere where we're starting to meet, and that's Thakker. And all the conversations I'm happy about AI policymaking, privacy is now coming up. They're used in tandem, or people are saying, oh, these are very much interrelated. We're at a 6 months ago, you'd see price, you'd thrown in an X, but it's now more front and center that we started wanting for here. I know that doesn't direct the question, but it's where I think it needs to go.
I had a question for Scott. This might be more complicated than a quick answer, but I've been trying to, as I'm reporting corporate AI, trying to learn more about FERC and its authorities, and they also set rates. So do these more local entities have some rate setting authorities separate from FERC, or
So it's like an outside of the energy system and the policy.
Yeah.
It makes all of the tech stuff we do simple. But right, then it's separate. So for this certain jurisdiction that is separate and not which handle stakes only, it depends on part of the country, it depends on what RTO. It's different. And it's like different pieces of the entire energy sort of system that they're setting rates for. So
maybe just as a quick follow-up on that, because the Trump administration has a lot of ideas about how they want this stuff to go. So these local entities could take things in a slightly different direction potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. This question is also for Scott. I've been hearing a little bit about community bargaining agreements, and I'm wondering first if that's something that could be effectuated through a PUC, if that's separate, and whether you've heard of success in things where bargaining agreements, not just around energy pricing, but things like maybe seed funding for some kind of digital inclusion or adoption initiative.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't read of that in the shockers to PUCs. I mean, the funny about PUCs is like really narrow. Like they text, they're like narrow. So it's sort of it's serious, right? So like it's only about regulating utilities and pretty much just like approving upgrades, the cost that they're going to infrastructure development or like setting the price. So I can't flag for arguing it's for what exactly?
Basically, from the community's perspective, you're going to the data center. Or to build data center.
Yeah, so I think that's more at the county level, less like at the, so it's zoning or, so, you can't think about PUC is this people only regulated that matters. There are small ones, right? And there's all of these other regulators in the state and federal level that also are playing a key role. It's a regulatory price or philosophy.
Yeah, so on a related note, I'm not sure if this is the same part of the regulatory ecosystem, PUCs or something else, but I was at a conference 2 weeks ago on surveillance, and there was some emerging talk coming up about how public utilities seem to be possibly having data collected if it would go to middlemen and data brokers, ultimately feed those data into systems like Palantir's large-scale surveillance. I'm curious if you've heard anything in that domain, and if you think that public utility commissions could have an impact on the way that this customer interaction happens besides data centers, in terms of what data is being collected by public utility providers and where it's being shared.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Just to start, yes, that is a huge concern. Not necessarily that I'm aware of with PUCs, but we know that the federal government is obtaining data from states, from municipal governments, or county governments, often against existing local laws through third parties. So we know that's happening. The data that being said, I would say there's actually like a sort of a fight around the sort of data that PUCs can request of data centers, or it's pretty much been within their purview to have access to all sorts of data for utilities. So like that is really a question there. So that each regulator, they collect and review a lot of data. But as far as we're seeing this out in a lot of the legislative proposals around data centers that the PUC state will have to audit to requests to environmental data. I have no idea what would go on with that, what would happen to that data after the fact. It's a really good question about making sure that if we do institute those sorts of new requirements, that we include very aggressive price protections.
I heard there's a lot of data that's being used combined with AI to do data center energy management. It's just also really interesting. So.
I'm going to add one more. We didn't coordinate this at all, but there is a draft bill, a proposed bill in Vermont that would be expanding the state PUC's authority to cover data centers. It proposes regulating data centers as utilities in the state. So that's an example of how, if you expand the powers, they may have additional authority over some of the data center operations, things like that, through that kind of framework. And I think there's also valuable lessons to be taken from existing other kinds of regulatory structures, like the Federal Communications Commission and their very long-standing set of protections for private consumer information. There's very strict controls in terms of how telecom companies are allowed to use customer information that collect telecom companies next to how the FCC regulates that. So that's something that can be replicated.
So Howard found, just first of all, if you like PUCs, New York, which is the trade association for public utility commissions, is having their Washington policy meeting a couple of blocks that away. They're in town for a couple of days. Yeah, knock yourselves out, guys. But on Spectrum, why stop at the bottom half of 7.1.2? Why would it make sense if you can have sharing without interference with military applications to simply extend through the entire, add another 1,000 megahertz, get those bigger channels, because we're going to keep needing bigger channels for rate of throughput.
It would take it. No, definitely, because there's no intention to stop at that. And it's a great point that, why I kept mentioning lower 7 and not actually 7 and 8. I think this ties with the fact that in OB3A, 7.4 to 8.4, nobody's touching that band because of the federal incumbency. So we cannot actually go beyond that. So of course, 7.125 to 7.400, that band definitely is under study. NCTA is actually looking into that as well. If we think about it, in the band alignment of what we showed, this is actually natural expansion. But if you can go beyond 7.250, yes, Wi-Fi would definitely benefit. And as I briefly mentioned, that 640 megahertz channel, one channel that big, can do massive amount of data transfer, dual latency application. This is all Wi-Fi. So remember, it's not going to go outside. It's not going to actually interfere with any of the incumbents. But if you can get that vast amount of channel right here in this room, yes, we can do a number of things with that. But considering the OB3A and what NTI and FCC are considering, the focus is just how that 125 right now. That would be ideal, and we can get that fourth standard 320 megahertz channel.
Well, one good thing is, it will be possible. It's been definitely put off, because what's interesting is the one beautiful bill basically prohibited any auction of that 500 megahertz in the middle of 7. So it won't be auctioned, but that doesn't mean it can't be shared, for example, for Wi-Fi use indoor only Wi-Fi use, and really fairly soon. In fact, the DOT, they have a little problem with that because they, by definition, are operating outdoors. And at the last World Radio Conference, they put that it's called a NATO ban. They put that same 500 megahertz out of limits for mobile carriers, again, across the region to Europe and Africa. So it could still be available for Wi-Fi, but it seems like nobody in the current government wants to talk about that. They just want to talk about what are we getting in the next auction.
Hi, Elizabeth Godzilla. I also just want to point out Nick had a lot to do with that. So I actually did want to ask Kitsusuka question about sort of your AI definition. Which obviously there's a rest of any is that sure definition of this and be a lot of flexibility as you risk being trapped by these tolerance. How are you assessing it by the risk in light of how issues evolve? There's no stable entity that I fully control. Training, deployment, downstream, developer, interpreter, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I would say the key takeaway for me, going through the whole research process of putting together the gun book and reading the different entries there, is that you're going to have different definitions. It's an unsatisfying answer perhaps, but there's different definitions that are suitable for different purposes. To make it more concrete, something like the NCTA definition, which is very broad, it includes a scope of different kinds of AI, might be really effective if what you're looking to do is funding or research-oriented bill, which is what it was originally intended for. The thing that you want to caution people against is just because this is a definition of AI that already exists in the law, that doesn't mean that you want to import it into your regulation bill, just because it's what already exists. So it doesn't mean that it's suitable for that other purpose. You want to maybe use it for specific kinds of things. Similarly, you're going to get this for some of the other kinds of approaches when you have something like as the auto decision system definitions. A lot of those bills rely on scoping using other related terms like covered platform, something like that, to get at the right size of player or the right type of tool, but they use a very broad definition of the technology. And so there's ways to mix and match even some of those components and say, can we use a very broad definition in some technical sense, but combine it with a covered platform thing? Yeah, I'm getting no from the audience here. And another element of it is, and one of the motivations on the project is that some of these definitions, it used to be the case that you could rely on very broad definitions and that agencies or other regulators could interpret and scope it thanks to admin law and deference. That's no longer the case. Now you have to get it correct in the statutes, it seems, if you want to have these definitions. So there's a greater incentive now for lawmakers and policymakers to get this right up front, to be very thoughtful about what you're doing with the definition.
All right, that concludes our lightning talk session. Thank you to speakers.